They told him to leave, but his response left an entire room speechless and changed their lives forever. The diner was a staple in the small Indiana town, a relic of the 1950s, with its neon sign flickering above the entrance and checkered curtains framing the windows. It had a reputation for hearty meals and the kind of service where the waitress knew your name and how you liked your coffee. For Malcolm Andrews, it was his first stop after returning home from deployment, a quiet place to sit, eat, and feel a semblance of normality after months of chaos overseas. The parking lot was nearly full, with pickup trucks lined up beside a few sedans. Malcolm stepped out of his truck, his polished boots crunching against the gravel. His uniform was immaculate, not a thread out of place, and the medals pinned to his chest caught the soft afternoon light, a testament to the sacrifices he'd made and the courage he'd shown. But Malcolm wasn't one to draw attention to himself. For him, the uniform wasn't about accolades, it was about service and duty, principles he held on to even when they felt like a heavy weight to bear. As he approached the diner, the door jingled with a small bell above it. Inside, the familiar hum of a small-town gathering greeted him, laughter, clinking silverware, the sizzle of burgers on the griddle. The air was thick with the comforting scent of frying bacon and brewed coffee, the kind of aroma that told you this place was home for many. Malcolm stepped in, and for a brief moment, the room seemed to pause. Conversation softened, forks hovered midair, and curious eyes glanced in his direction. It wasn't hostility, it was something subtler, a mix of surprise and uncertainty. A soldier in full uniform wasn't an everyday sight here, and his presence demanded a moment of acknowledgement. He met the curious stares with a polite nod before scanning the room. Booths lined the walls, most of them occupied by families, older couples, and a few teenagers glued to their phones. A jukebox in the corner played a faint country tune, blending seamlessly into the background. Near the window, a small table sat empty, bathed in the golden glow of the afternoon sun. Malcolm made his way to the table, the sound of his boots clicking against the tile floor drawing a few more glances. He moved with the kind of confidence that came from years of discipline, but his expression was calm, almost reserved. Sitting down, he eased into the chair, his hands brushing over the worn edges of the menu as he glanced at the offerings. It was simple, classic diner fare: burgers, milkshakes, fries, exactly what he needed after months of eating field rations. A waitress approached, her notepad in hand. She was in her 40s, with a tired but friendly smile and eyes that hinted at a hard-working life. Her hair was tied back in a neat ponytail, and her uniform, though slightly faded, was spotless. "What can I get you, hon?" she asked, her voice carrying the warmth of someone who'd worked in hospitality long enough to know how to put people at ease. Malcolm smiled faintly. "Just a burger and coffee, black, thanks." She jotted down his order with a nod, her pen moving quickly over the pad. "Coming right up. Let me know if you need anything else." As she walked away, Malcolm leaned back in his chair, his gaze drifting to the window. The street outside was quiet, with only the occasional car rolling by. He felt a brief moment of peace, a small reprieve from the noise in his head, the memories of far-off places that never quite left him. Alone for the first time in days, he allowed himself to feel the stillness, the normalcy. But not everyone shared his moment of peace. Near the counter, the diner's manager leaned against the wall, arms crossed over his chest. He was a broad-shouldered man with graying hair and a deep furrow etched permanently between his brows. His eyes fixed on Malcolm, scanning him in a way that felt invasive, almost challenging. It wasn't curiosity, it was suspicion. Malcolm noticed the gaze but didn't react. Years of training had taught him when to pick his battles, and this wasn't one of them. He focused on the window, watching the sunlight bounce off the chrome bumpers of the cars parked outside. Yet he couldn't shake the subtle tension in the room. It was the way conversations dipped slightly as he walked in, the way forks clattered just a little louder against plates. It wasn't overt, but it was there, a ripple he couldn't ignore. The waitress returned with his coffee, setting it down gently in front of him. "Your burger will be out in a minute," she said, her tone kind but hurried. Malcolm thanked her, lifting the steaming cup to his lips. The bitterness of the coffee was grounding, a small comfort in an unfamiliar setting. For a moment, he allowed himself to relax. The world outside the diner faded, and it was just him and his coffee, the warmth of the mug seeping into his hands. But as he took another sip, the manager's voice cut through the air, low, but unmistakably directed at him. The man had started walking toward Malcolm's table, his footsteps slow and deliberate. Malcolm set his cup down, his shoulders tensing slightly. Whatever peace he had felt moments ago was about to be shattered. The sound of the manager's boots grew louder as he approached, each step carrying a weight that Malcolm couldn't ignore. And when the man finally stopped in front of him, the room seemed to hold its breath. The manager stopped a few feet from Malcolm's table, his posture stiff and his arms crossed tightly over his chest. His presence drew subtle attention from the other patrons, who glanced up from their meals in growing curiosity. Malcolm looked up from his coffee, his calm expression meeting the manager's stony glare. The air felt heavier now, the warmth of the diner giving way to a tension that crept into every corner of the room. "I'm going to have to ask you to leave," the manager said, his voice low but firm. Malcolm tilted his head slightly, unsure if he heard correctly. "Excuse me?" he asked, his tone polite but edged with curiosity. You heard me. The manager repeated, his words sharper this time. We reserve the right to refuse service. You need to go. For a moment, Malcolm just stared at him, the calm mask he perfected in the military slipping into place. It wasn't the first time he faced hostility, but something about being back home made this sting in a way he hadn't expected. He glanced around the diner, noticing how the room had gone unnaturally quiet. Forks hummed suspended over plates, and even the jukebox seemed to have dulled to a faint hum. I'm just here for a meal, Malcolm said, his voice even. Nothing more. The manager leaned in slightly, his eyes narrowing. This isn't about the food, he said, his tone dripping with implication. Malcolm's grip tightened around the edge of the table. He didn't respond right away, instead letting the manager's words hang in the air, giving everyone in the room a chance to feel the weight of what was happening. Slowly, deliberately, Malcolm leaned back in his chair, his gaze steady. Let me make sure I understand, he said, his voice calm but carrying an edge. I walked in, ordered a burger and coffee, and now you're telling me I need to leave. Why? The manager shifted uncomfortably but held his ground. Like I said, we reserve the right to refuse service, and I'm exercising that right. Malcolm's eyes scanned the room again. A few patrons looked away, pretending to focus on their plates. Others stared openly, their expressions a mix of curiosity and unease. Near the counter, the waitress who had taken Malcolm's order stood frozen, her pen hovering above her notepad. She opened her mouth as if to say something but hesitated, glancing nervously between Malcolm and the manager. Malcolm stood slowly, his chair scraping against the floor. He was taller than the manager by a good few inches, and the way he carried himself, shoulders back, head high, made the difference seem even greater. He didn't raise his voice, he didn't have to. I serve this country, he said, his words deliberate. I wore this uniform for you, for everyone in this room. I've spent years defending the freedoms you take for granted every day, and now you're telling me I don't belong here. The room was completely silent now, the tension so thick it was almost suffocating. The manager's face flushed red, but it was unclear whether it was from anger or embarrassment. Look, he said, his voice faltering slightly. I don't care where you served. This is my restaurant, and I make the rules. Malcolm took a step closer, his gaze never wavering. You're right, he said quietly. It is your restaurant. But let me ask you this. What kind of man turns away someone who's given everything to protect the very freedoms he enjoys? The manager didn't answer, his mouth opening and closing as if searching for the right words. The patrons watched in silence, their discomfort growing with each passing second. The young couple in the booth nearest to Malcolm exchanged uneasy glances, while an older man at the counter shook his head, his lips pressed into a thin line. Malcolm could feel the weight of every eye in the room on him, but he didn't let it rattle him. Years of training had taught him how to stand his ground even in the face of hostility, but this wasn't a battlefield, and the enemy wasn't someone carrying a weapon. It was ignorance, prejudice, and the quiet complicity of those who chose to look the other way. He reached into the pocket of his uniform, moving slowly and deliberately. A murmur rippled through the diner as a few patrons tensed, their imaginations jumping to the worst conclusions. Malcolm noticed but didn't react. He wasn't here to escalate the situation, he was here to make a point. From his pocket, he pulled out a neatly folded piece of paper. It was worn around the edges, the creases saw from being handled too many times. Holding it up for a moment, he said, I wasn't planning to share this today, but maybe it's time I did. The manager frowned, his brow furrowing in confusion. Malcolm unfolded the paper with care, the silence in the room so complete that the faint rustle of the paper seemed deafening. This, Malcolm began, his voice steady, is a letter from the family of Corporal Matthew Rivera. He served with me overseas. He didn't make it back. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. The tension in the room shifted, the hostility giving way to something quieter, curiosity, maybe even guilt. Malcolm looked at the letter in his hands, then back at the room. Before I read this, I want you to understand something, he said. This uniform I'm wearing, it's not just for me. It's for him, for his family, for every person who's ever had to say goodbye to someone they loved, not knowing if they'd come back. And as he began to read the words from the letter, they carried a weight that no one in the diner could ignore, leaving them hanging on his every word. Malcolm took a breath, steadying himself before beginning to read the letter aloud. The paper trembled slightly in his hands, though not from fear. It was the weight of the words, the memories they carried and the emotions they would inevitably stir. His voice, low and steady, cut through the silence of the diner. Dear Sergeant Andrews, we wanted to write to you as a family, not just to express our gratitude, but to let you know how much your actions have meant to us during the hardest time of our lives. Malcolm paused, glancing around the room. Some patrons had set down their forks and knives, their meals forgotten. The older man at the counter leaned forward, elbows resting on the formica surface, his brow furrowed in concentration. The young mother with her toddler in the corner held her child close, her expression softening with each word. Malcolm continued, his voice growing stronger. Matthew always spoke so highly of you. He told us how you looked out for your team, how you made sure no one felt alone, even in the darkest moments. He said you weren't just a leader, You were the kind of person who made others believe in something greater. The manager, who had been so confident moments ago, now looked visibly uncomfortable. He shifted on his feet, crossing and uncrossing his arms as if the weight of the letter's words were pressing down on him. Malcolm didn't acknowledge him. He kept reading. Knowing that you were with Matthew when he took his last breath means more to us than words can ever express. You gave him comfort when we couldn't. You gave him strength when he needed it most. Malcolm's voice faltered slightly, but he didn't stop. He swallowed hard, regaining his composure. As a family, we'd struggled to make sense of this loss, but your actions have reminded us of the good that still exists in this world. You are a hero, not just because of the uniform you wear, but because of the heart you carry. Thank you for being there for our son when he needed it most. He folded the letter carefully, his movements slow and deliberate. The room was completely silent, the weight of the story hanging over everyone like a heavy fog. Malcolm looked up, his gaze sweeping across the room. He wasn't just addressing the manager now, he was speaking to everyone. Corporal Rivera was 23 years old, he said, his voice calm but firm. He had his whole life ahead of him, a fiancée he was planning to marry, a family who adored him, and he gave all of that up so people like you and me could sit in a place like this, sharing meals, living our lives. Malcolm's eyes landed on the manager, who now stood near the counter, his face pale and his arms hanging awkwardly at his sides. When we put on this uniform, we don't ask who we're protecting. We don't care what they look like, where they come from, or how they feel about us. We do it because we believe in something bigger than ourselves. His voice dropped lower, but the intensity of his words only grew. But today, I walked into this diner wearing the same uniform I wore overseas, and I was told I don't belong. A murmur rippled through the room, the first sign of life from the patrons who had been stunned into silence. A teenage boy near the jukebox fidgeted with his phone, his expression a mix of guilt and discomfort. The older man at the counter shook his head slightly, his lips pressed into a thin line. Malcolm's gaze softened, and he turned to address the entire room. I wasn't going to say anything, I was just going to leave. But then I thought about Matthew. I thought about his family, his dreams, and everything he sacrificed, and I realized I'd owe it to him and to every other soldier who's made that sacrifice to speak up. The young mother near the window wiped a tear from her cheek, her toddler squirming in her lap. The waitress, who had been standing frozen by the kitchen, now clutched her notepad tightly against her chest, her eyes glistening. Malcolm's final words cut through the thick silence like a blade. This isn't just about me, it's about all of us. What kind of people are we if we can't show basic respect to those who've given everything for us? As Malcolm's words settled over the room, the tension transformed into something else entirely, a quiet reckoning, a moment of collective reflection that left everyone waiting for what would happen next. The silence in the diner felt almost deafening after Malcolm's words. People exchanged uneasy glances, their expressions a mixture of shame and introspection. No one dared to speak at first, the weight of what they had just heard pressing down on the room like an invisible force. Then, breaking the silence, the older man sitting at the counter stood up, his chair scraped against the floor as he reached for his wallet, his movements slow but deliberate. He cleared his throat, his voice steady but filled with conviction. Sir, he said, addressing Malcolm, I'd like to pay for your meal. It's the least I can do for someone who's given so much for this country. The manager, still frozen near the counter, opened his mouth as if to protest, but the older man silenced him with a sharp glance. If there's an issue with that, he said firmly, you'll have to take it up with me. Malcolm looked at the man, his expression softening. That's kind of you, he said, but I don't need charity. It's not charity, the man replied, his tone unwavering. It's respect. Before Malcolm could respond, a young woman sitting in a booth near the window spoke up. She had a toddler in her lap who squirmed as she tried to keep him still. I'll pitch in too, she said, her voice trembling slightly. You deserve to eat here just like anyone else. One by one, more voices joined in. You've got my respect, said a truck driver in the corner, nodding toward Malcolm. I'll cover his coffee, the waitress said, stepping forward from her spot near the kitchen. She looked directly at Malcolm, her eyes glistening. My brother served too. He didn't make it home. Thank you for everything you've done. Even the teenage boy near the jukebox, who had been fidgeting awkwardly moments before, stood and gave Malcolm a small salute. It was clumsy, and his face flushed red with embarrassment, but the gesture was sincere. The manager, who had been shrinking further into the background with every passing moment, now looked entirely out of place in his own establishment. His face was pale, his arms hanging uselessly at his sides. He glanced around the room, realizing that he was alone in his stance. I didn't mean to cause a scene, the manager muttered, his voice barely audible. Malcolm turned to face him fully, his calm demeanor unshaken. You didn't just cause a scene, he said, his voice quiet but firm. You showed everyone here exactly who you are. The question is, what are you going to do about it? The manager's face flushed deep red, and he looked down at the floor, unable to meet Malcolm's gaze. For a moment, he seemed to wrestle with his thoughts, his pride warring with the guilt that was now unmistakably etched across his features. I made a mistake, he stammered. His voice cracked slightly as he glanced around the room, as if searching for some kind of support, but none came. The other patrons were silent, their faces a mix of disapproval and expectation. Apologies don't mean much unless they come with change, Malcolm said. His words were simple, but they carried a weight that settled heavily in the air. The manager nodded slowly, his expression still uneasy. You're right, he admitted. I'm sorry. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The tension in the room began to ease, the hostility giving way to something softer, an unspoken understanding that things could and should be different. The waitress stepped forward again, placing a steaming cup of coffee in front of Malcolm. Her hands were trembling slightly, but her smile was genuine. Your coffee's on me, she said softly. Malcolm looked up at her, his expression warm. Thank you, he said. He turned to address the room once more, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had lived through more than most could imagine. This isn't just about me, he said. It's about how we treat each other, every single one of us. If we can't show respect and kindness to the people sitting next to us, then what are we even fighting for? The young mother near the window wiped a tear from her cheek, her toddler now dozing peacefully in her arms. The older man at the counter nodded solemnly, his weathered face thoughtful. Even the truck driver in the corner, who had been silently observing the whole time, seemed moved by Malcolm's words. As the room settled into a contemplative silence, all eyes remained on Malcolm, waiting to see what he would do next. But his next act wasn't what anyone expected. It was something that would stay with them long after he walked out the door. Malcolm stood there for a moment, letting the weight of the room settle. The silence wasn't heavy with tension anymore. It felt different now, like a collective pause as everyone reflected on what had just happened. He reached into his pocket again, this time pulling out his wallet. Without hesitation, he took out a crisp $20 bill and placed it on the table. I'm paying for my meal, he said firmly, his voice carrying across the room. Not because I have to, but because I want to. Respect isn't something that's handed to you. It's something you give, no matter what. And this is how I choose to give it. The statement caught everyone off guard, even the manager, who now looked like he wanted to disappear into the kitchen. Malcolm wasn't bitter, nor did he seem angry. There was a quiet strength in his actions, the kind that spoke louder than words ever could. He wasn't demanding pity, nor was he looking for applause. He was simply showing them the dignity he expected in return. Turning toward the older man at the counter, Malcolm extended his hand. Thank you, he said, his tone filled with genuine gratitude, not just for what you said, but for standing up when it mattered. The older man shook his hand firmly, his expression resolute. I should be thanking you, he replied, for your service, for what you've done, and for reminding us all of what's important. Next, Malcolm turned to the young mother who was still holding her toddler close. Your kindness today means more than you know, he said softly, his words making her eyes well up with tears. She nodded, unable to speak, and gave him a small, grateful smile. As Malcolm stepped away from the table, the teenage boy who had saluted him earlier walked up timidly. His hands were stuffed into his pockets, but his face was determined. Thank you for being brave, the boy said, his voice cracking slightly with nerves. Malcolm knelt slightly to meet the boy's gaze, his expression warm and encouraging. It takes more bravery to stand up for what's right than to fight any battle, he said. Remember that. One day you'll need to stand up for someone else, and when that day comes, I hope you do. The boy's face lit up with pride, and he nodded enthusiastically. His parents, who had been watching from their booth, exchanged a glance that seemed to hold a silent acknowledgement. They would remember this moment for a long time. Finally, Malcolm's eyes landed on the manager. The man's face was still red, his shoulders slumped as if the weight of his guilt had physically diminished him. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. Malcolm stepped closer, closing the distance between them. His voice was calm but carried an undeniable authority. I'm not angry with you, Malcolm said, but you need to ask yourself why you felt the need to treat me differently. Change doesn't happen unless we're willing to face the truth about ourselves. The manager nodded, his gaze fixed on the floor. I'll do better, he mumbled, the words barely audible. Malcolm stepped back and gave him a single small nod. It wasn't forgiveness. It was an acknowledgement that the first step toward change had been taken. As he moved toward the door, the waitress stopped him one last time. She hesitated, her notepad clutched tightly in her hands. Sir, she said, her voice trembling slightly, before you go, I just want you to know my brother served too. He didn't make it home. When you talked about Matthew, it reminded me of him. Thank you for everything. Malcolm's expression softened. Your brother's sacrifice isn't forgotten, he said gently. None of them are, and it's people like you who keep their memory alive. The waitress nodded, blinking away tears. As Malcolm stepped outside, the bell above the door jingled faintly, and the golden light of the setting sun cast long shadows across the diner's parking lot. He paused by his truck, looking back at the building. Through the window, he could see the young boy animatedly talking to his parents, the waitress wiping down the counter with a newfound sense of purpose, and the older man staring thoughtfully into his coffee. Even the manager had disappeared into the back, perhaps taking time to reflect on his actions. Malcolm climbed into his truck, the engine rumbling to life as he pulled onto the road. He thought about Matthew and the countless others who had never made it home. Their sacrifices weren't just for him, they were for everyone, even those who didn't always see the value in it. Inside the diner, the mood had shifted completely. Patrons spoke in hushed tones, sharing quiet reflections about what they had just witnessed. For the people in that room, this moment wasn't just a fleeting confrontation, it was a mirror, forcing them to see the biases they carried and the courage it took to challenge them. As Malcolm drove into the fading light, his actions left a mark that would ripple far beyond that small diner. It wasn't just about a meal, it was about respect, dignity, and the power of one man's courage to change hearts and minds. Malcolm's truck moved steadily down the quiet road, the golden hues of the setting sun casting long, warm shadows across the landscape. His thoughts swirled as the diner receded in his rearview mirror. He wasn't looking for gratitude or validation. Those had never been his reasons for serving. But what happened in that small diner today wasn't about him. It was about something much larger. The kind of country his service was meant to protect, and the kind of people they all aspired to be. He touched the pocket of his uniform, feeling the outline of the folded letter inside. Corporal Matthew Rivera's family had entrusted him with something sacred, a testament to sacrifice, love, and the cost of freedom. It wasn't just words on paper, it was a call to action, a reminder of the values he had vowed to uphold, even when the world seemed to forget them. As the town faded into the distance, Malcolm couldn't help but replay the faces he had seen inside the diner, the boy with the awkward salute, standing taller by the end of their brief exchange, the young mother who had clutched her child a little closer, perhaps wondering what kind of world her son would grow up in, the older man at the counter, whose weathered hands had reached out not just to pay for a meal, but to show solidarity when it mattered most. Even the manager, who had begun the day with cold indifference, had been forced to confront the consequences of his actions. Change wasn't instant, it never was. Malcolm knew that better than most. It was slow, often uncomfortable, and sometimes painful, but every moment mattered. Every choice, every word, every small act of courage built towards something greater. The seeds of change had been planted in that diner, and though Malcolm might never see the fruits of those efforts, he knew they would grow. Back in the diner, the atmosphere lingered with the weight of what had transpired. Conversations were quieter, more thoughtful. The young waitress wiped down tables with a focus she hadn't felt in years, replaying Malcolm's words in her mind. For her, this wasn't just another shift, it was a turning point. She resolved to carry her brother's memory with pride, to honor his sacrifice by treating everyone she encountered with kindness and dignity. The teenage boy who had saluted Malcolm sat with his parents, speaking animatedly. His father, who had watched the entire incident unfold with quiet contemplation, finally said, "Remember this moment, son. When you see something wrong, you speak up. You do the right thing, no matter how hard it is." The boy nodded earnestly, his young mind already absorbing the lessons of the day. Even the manager, who had disappeared into the back of the restaurant, wasn't the same man who had confronted Malcolm. He sat in his office, staring at the wall, replaying every word Malcolm had said. The uniform, the letter, the quiet strength. It all chipped away at the defenses he had built over the years. For the first time in a long time, he questioned himself in a way he hadn't before. He didn't know if he could change overnight, but the spark had been lit. As Malcolm drove through the open roads of Indiana, his thoughts shifted to Matthew Rivera and the countless others who had given their lives for the ideals this country claimed to stand for. It wasn't just about freedom or patriotism, it was about people. It was about ensuring that every individual, regardless of who they were or where they came from, was treated with respect and dignity. Pulling over at a quiet overlook, Malcolm parked the truck and stepped out. The sun was dipping below the horizon now, painting the sky in hues of amber and crimson. He leaned against the hood, the cool evening breeze carrying the faint scent of grass and distant pine trees. Reaching into his pocket, he pulled out the letter again, unfolding it with care. For a moment, he just stared at the words. They weren't just a family's gratitude. They were a promise that their son's sacrifice wouldn't be in vain, that the values he fought for would live on. Malcolm read the final lines once more. "You are a hero, not just for what you've done, but for the heart you carry. Thank you." He folded the letter carefully, placing it back in his pocket. Taking a deep breath, he gazed out at the fading light. The world wasn't perfect, and it might never be. But moments like these, moments of connection, courage, and self-reflection, were the building blocks of something better. As the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Malcolm climbed back into his truck and started the engine. The road stretched out before him, long and winding but filled with possibility. His work wasn't done, but he didn't need to see the end result to know it was worth it. So the question remains, what would you do in that moment? Would you stay silent or would you stand up? Change begins with us. Every choice, every word, every action.